A successful black businesswoman faces her husband's betrayal. He leaves for a young mistress, emptying all the accounts and declaring that everything now belongs to him. But she makes him deeply regret it. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. Amara hadn't expected much from the networking event. As the owner of an expanding boutique chain, she attended these gatherings more out of obligation than interest. Her schedule was packed, her ambitions focused on growth, and the prospect of mingling with strangers felt like a tedious formality. Yet, that evening, something shifted. Amid the clinking of champagne glasses and polite chatter, she met Garrett. He stood out immediately, not for his looks, though he was undeniably attractive with sharp blue eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, but for the way he carried himself. Confident, but not overbearing, charismatic, but not flashy. Amara noticed how he effortlessly navigated the room, his charm pulling people toward him. When their eyes met across the room, he smiled warmly and made his way over to her. "Amara, right?" he asked, extending a hand. "I overheard someone mentioning your boutique. Impressive work." She was taken aback. People rarely took the time to recognize her accomplishments at these events. Often, her presence was overlooked, dismissed as another small business owner trying to play in the big leagues. But Garrett seemed genuinely interested. As the evening unfolded, their conversation flowed easily. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, her vision, and her journey to success. For the first time in a long time, Amara felt seen, not as a businesswoman navigating a predominantly white industry, but as a person with a story worth telling. Garrett seemed to appreciate her drive, and his laughter came easily when she shared anecdotes about her early struggles. By the end of the night, he'd asked for her number. "I'd love to hear more about your plans," he said, his tone warm and earnest. "And, if I'm being honest, I'd love to see you again." Amara hesitated briefly. She'd been so focused on her business that romance felt like a distant, impractical pursuit. But something about Garrett disarmed her. He seemed sincere, grounded, and supportive, a refreshing change from the dismissive attitudes she often encountered. Their first date was over coffee, then dinner, and soon after, they were inseparable. Garrett showed a side of himself that made Amara believe she'd found someone who genuinely valued her. He listened when she vented about the challenges of running a business, offered advice without condescension, and celebrated her victories with an enthusiasm that felt real. "You inspire me," he said one evening as they walked hand in hand through the park. "The way you've built something from nothing. I've never met anyone like you." Amara, who had always been cautious with her emotions, found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone else. Garrett seemed to understand her world. He didn't shy away from the complexities of her life or diminish her experiences as a black woman in a competitive industry. If anything, he seemed proud to be by her side. When he introduced her to his family a few months into their relationship, Amara braced herself for the worst. Garrett had hinted that his parents were traditional, a word that often masked more uncomfortable truths, but to her surprise, they were polite, if a bit reserved. His mother complimented Amara's boutique, and his father nodded approvingly when Garrett mentioned her success. Still, there were subtle moments that didn't sit well with her. A glance that lingered too long, a comment that felt veiled in something unspoken. Garrett dismissed her concerns when she brought them up. "They're just old-fashioned," he said. "They'll come around once they get to know you better." Amara wanted to believe him. After all, Garrett had never given her a reason to doubt him. He supported her dreams, showed up for her when it mattered, and seemed genuinely invested in their future. So, when he proposed a year later during a private dinner at her favorite restaurant, she said yes. The wedding was a grand affair, blending Amara's cultural heritage with Garrett's more understated preferences. Her family embraced the celebration with open arms, their joy infectious. Garrett's family was more restrained, their smiles tight but present. Amara chose to focus on the positive, reassuring herself that any lingering tension would fade with time. Married life began smoothly. Garrett moved into Amara's spacious home, a property she'd bought with the profits from her first boutique. He praised her ambition and often told friends how proud he was of his wife's accomplishments. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Amara finally allowed herself to believe that she'd found a partner who truly understood her. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. And though Amara didn't know it yet, the foundation she thought was solid was already starting to shift. At first, Amara dismissed the small things. Marriage, she reminded herself, was an adjustment for anyone, and expecting perfection was unrealistic. Still, there were moments when Garrett's behavior pricked at her sense of peace, leaving behind an unease she couldn't quite place. The first time she noticed something off was during a dinner party she hosted for her closest friends and business associates. Amara had spent days planning the event, carefully curating the menu, and ensuring the atmosphere reflected her personal touch. Garrett, ever the charming host, seemed to enjoy himself, mingling effortlessly with her guests. But later that night, as they cleaned up, his tone shifted. "Your friend, Jasmine," he said, setting down a tray of empty glasses. "She's a bit loud, don't you think?" Amara looked up, surprised. "Loud? She's always been vibrant. That's just who she is." "Vibrant," he repeated with a faint smirk. "Sure, but maybe tone it down next time. She overshadowed you at your own party." Amara brushed it off, chalking it up to a misunderstanding. But as the weeks went on, Garrett's comments became more frequent and pointed. He critiqued the way her friends dressed, spoke, or acted. His disdain was subtle, cloaked in what he called observations, but it was there nonetheless. "Why do you always surround yourself with people like that?" he asked one evening after Amara had returned from brunch with friends. "I just think they don't reflect who you are now." Amara felt a chill creep up her spine. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," he said, brushing past her. "I'm just saying you've outgrown certain circles. You're running a business, Amara. Maybe it's time to start thinking about how that looks." It was a small comment, easy to dismiss on the surface, but it stayed with her. Garrett had always been supportive, or so she thought, but now it seemed his support came with unspoken conditions. Over time, his critiques expanded beyond her friends to her business itself. He began questioning her decisions, often framing his doubts as helpful advice. When she announced plans to expand her boutique, his response was lukewarm. "Are you sure now's the right time?" he asked, his brows furrowing. "It's a big risk." Amara was taken aback. "Garrett, I've done the research. The numbers make sense." "I'm not saying you can't do it," he said, raising his hands defensively. "I'm just saying you might want to be careful. You've got a lot on the line." The conversation ended there, but the seed of doubt he'd planted lingered. Amara started noticing other things too, subtle shifts in his behavior that hinted at something deeper. He became increasingly controlling, asking for more input on her financial decisions. When she resisted, reminding him that her business was separate from their marriage, he would sigh and shake his head. "I'm just trying to help," he'd say. "You act like I don't have your best interests at heart." But it wasn't just the control. Garrett's demeanor toward her began to change. He grew impatient, snapping at her over minor things. If she pointed it out, he'd deny it, accusing her of being overly sensitive. His sarcasm, once playful, took on a sharper edge. "You're so independent, Amara," he said one night after she declined his suggestion to merge their bank accounts. "It's like you don't even need me." It stung more than she cared to admit. She prided herself on her independence. It was what had carried her through years of hard work and late nights building her boutique. But Garrett made it sound like a flaw. Then there were his comments about race. Small at first, but impossible to ignore. At a family gathering, one of his uncles made an offhand remark about Amara's natural hair, suggesting it was so unique and exotic. Amara's smile tightened, but before she could respond, Garrett interjected. "She's lucky she can pull it off," he said, grinning. "Not everyone can." Amara froze. His words stung, not for their content alone, but for the casual way he aligned himself with the ignorance she'd spent a lifetime navigating. Later, when she confronted him, he waved her concerns away. "Babe, come on," he said. "You know I didn't mean anything by it. My family's just old-fashioned. They don't get it." But the excuses piled up. At first, she tried to reason with him, believing his ignorance stemmed from a lack of understanding. She explained how microaggressions worked, how the comments he dismissed as harmless were actually layered with centuries of prejudice. Garrett would nod along, but his expressions often betrayed his disinterest. "You're overthinking this," he said, once, after she pointed out how he'd interrupted her during a meeting with a vendor. "Not everything is about race, Amara. Sometimes people are just people." The turning point came during an argument about her decision to hire more diverse staff for her boutique. Garrett scoffed at her reasoning. "Don't you think people should be hired based on their qualifications, not their skin color?" he said. Amara's stomach turned. "Are you seriously saying my staff isn't qualified?" "I'm just saying you're making it about something it doesn't need to be about," he replied, his tone clipped. For the first time, Amara began to see Garrett's true colors. He wasn't just dismissive of her concerns, he was actively undermining her. The man who had once seemed supportive and understanding was revealing himself to be someone who couldn't fully accept who she was, or what she represented. She started paying closer attention, keeping a mental tally of his words and actions. The pattern was unmistakable. Garrett didn't see her success as hers. He saw it as something he could influence, control, and ultimately take credit for. Amara began to pull back, guarding parts of herself that she had once shared freely. She stopped talking to him about her business and confided instead in her closest friends, who were quick to remind her of her worth. "You built everything on your own," Jasmine told her over coffee one afternoon. "Don't let him make you forget that." Amara nodded, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just about remembering her strength. It was about preparing for the possibility that Garrett might try to take it all away. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of someone else's shadow looming over her success. The realization came slowly but unmistakably. Garrett was not the man Amara thought he was. The partner who had once championed her dreams was now the source of her doubts. She didn't want to believe it at first, clinging to the memory of his charm, the early days of their relationship when he seemed like her biggest cheerleader. But the evidence was mounting, and Amara knew she couldn't afford to ignore it. Her first step was simple. She started paying closer attention. Garrett's behavior had shifted so subtly over time that it was easy to dismiss individual incidents as minor irritations or misunderstandings. But when she began to view them collectively, a troubling pattern emerged. His critiques of her decisions, the undermining comments, the veiled disdain for her friends and culture, it all painted a picture she could no longer deny. Garrett wasn't just unsupportive, he was resentful. Amara began documenting everything. It started as a precaution, a way to make sense of the chaos swirling in her mind. She kept a journal, recording his comments, his mood swings, and the way he tried to assert control over her business and finances. She saved text messages and emails, screenshots of conversations where his tone shifted from supportive to dismissive or even cruel. She didn't know yet what she would do with this information, but she knew it was important to have. The moment that solidified her resolve came one evening when Garrett returned home from work in a foul mood. Amara had just signed a lease for a second boutique location, a decision she'd made after months of research and planning. She'd expected Garrett to be proud of her, to celebrate the milestone. Instead, he frowned. "Another boutique?" he said, setting down his briefcase with more force than necessary. "Don't you think you're spreading yourself too thin?" Amara raised an eyebrow. "I've been planning this for months. It's a solid move, Garrett. You know that." He crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. "Sure, but just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. You've got a lot to lose if this goes sideways." Her chest tightened, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Garrett, I've built this business from the ground up. I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" he shot back. "Or are you just getting lucky again?" That word, lucky, hung in the air like a slap. Amara had heard it before, from people who dismissed her success as a fluke or the result of some affirmative action initiative. But hearing it from her husband, the person who was supposed to support her unconditionally, felt like a betrayal. She didn't argue with him that night. Instead, she went to her home office and locked the door, staring at the lease agreement she'd signed earlier that day. For the first time, she felt a pang of doubt. Not about her decision, but about her marriage. Garrett wasn't just questioning her choices, he was trying to erode her confidence. The next morning, Amara scheduled a meeting with a lawyer. It wasn't an easy decision. She wasn't ready to end her marriage, but she needed to understand her options. If Garrett's behavior escalated, she wanted to be prepared. The lawyer, a sharp and meticulous woman named Valerie, listened attentively as Amara described her concerns. "You're smart to come to me now," Valerie said, her tone matter of fact. "The biggest mistake people make is waiting until it's too late. Let's talk about protecting your assets." Over the course of an hour, Valerie walked Amara through the steps she needed to take. She explained the importance of separating personal and business finances, creating clear documentation of ownership, and establishing a safety net in case Garrett tried to stake a claim on her property or income. Amara left the meeting feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. She had a plan now, a way to shield herself from Garrett's growing hostility. But the fact that she needed such a plan was a bitter pill to swallow. She had married him because she believed in their partnership, in the future they could build together. Now, she was preparing for the possibility that he might try to take everything she'd worked for. Her first move was opening a new bank account in her name alone. She transferred a portion of her savings there, careful not to leave any trace that Garrett might stumble upon. Next, she reviewed the deed to her house, ensuring it remained solely in her name. The property had been her first major purchase after her boutique began turning a profit, and she had always been adamant about keeping it separate from their marriage. Now, that decision felt like a stroke of foresight. Amara also began reevaluating her business operations. She implemented stricter financial controls, ensuring that Garrett had no access to her company's accounts. She updated her legal documents, making it clear that her business was a sole proprietorship, not a marital asset. And she quietly started gathering evidence of Garrett's attempts to undermine her. Meanwhile, Garrett seemed oblivious to her preparations. He continued his subtle campaign of control, making comments about how they should combine their finances to simplify things. When Amara pushed back, he accused her of not trusting him. "I'm your husband, Amara," he said one evening, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why are you acting like I'm some kind of stranger?" She forced a smile, swallowing the words she wanted to say. In truth, Garrett did feel like a stranger, a man she no longer recognized, someone who had once been her partner but now seemed more like an adversary. As the weeks turned into months, Amara's preparations became second nature. She learned to mask her emotions, keeping her plans hidden behind a calm exterior. She stopped engaging in arguments with Garrett, choosing instead to focus on her work and the steps she was taking to protect herself. But beneath the surface, she was always watching, waiting for the moment when Garrett's true intentions would become undeniable. She didn't know when it would happen, but she knew it was only a matter of time. And when it did, she would be ready. Amara awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. At first, she thought it was another early morning email from one of her boutique managers. Instead, it was a notification for a new message. She glanced at the screen, her stomach knotting as she saw Garrett's name. The message wasn't what she expected. There was no greeting, no context, just a blunt announcement that felt like a slap in the face. "I'm leaving you. I've found someone else. I'll be filing for divorce. The house, the accounts, and everything else are mine now. Don't try to fight it." Amara stared at the screen, her mind struggling to process the words. She read them again, as though repeating them might change their meaning. But they didn't change. Garrett had made his move. The timing was calculated, almost cruel. Garrett knew she had an important meeting that morning, one that could secure a partnership with a luxury designer brand. He knew she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Amara took a deep breath, set her phone down, and forced herself to focus. She had prepared for this moment. Now it was time to act. The first thing she did was call Valerie, her lawyer. It was still early, but Valerie picked up immediately, her voice sharp and alert. "It's time," Amara said, her tone calm despite the storm brewing inside her. Garrett just made his move. Valerie didn't hesitate. "I'll file the necessary paperwork this morning. Let's freeze the joint accounts and ensure he can't touch anything he's not entitled to." Amara thanked her, hung up, and got ready for her day. She wasn't sure how she managed to get through the meeting, but she did. By the time she returned home that evening, she felt a sense of clarity, as though the adrenaline had burned away her initial shock. Garrett's message wasn't just a betrayal. It was an opportunity to finish what she had started. When she arrived at the house, Garrett's car was gone. It wasn't unusual for him to stay out late, another red flag she had learned to ignore, but tonight the emptiness felt different. It was final. She walked through the rooms, noting the subtle signs of his absence: a missing jacket, an empty space on the dresser where his watch used to sit. She found a manila envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a formal letter from Garrett's lawyer outlining his demands. He claimed ownership of the house, the boutique, and their joint accounts. He wanted her to vacate the property within 30 days and provide him with financial statements for her business. Amara almost laughed at the audacity. The house was hers, purchased long before their marriage, and she had the deed to prove it. The boutique was a sole proprietorship, protected by legal documentation. As for the joint accounts, she knew he had already drained them. The balance had been carefully calculated to avoid suspicion, a modest amount that wouldn't jeopardize her financial stability. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the dining table, rereading the letter. Garrett's arrogance was astounding. He truly believed he could take everything she had built, as though her success was his by proxy. But he didn't understand the depth of her preparation. The next few days were a whirlwind of action. Valerie filed an emergency motion to freeze their joint assets and issued formal notifications to financial institutions, ensuring Garrett couldn't access any funds tied to Amara's business. Amara also contacted her accountant to review her financial records, compiling detailed documentation to present in court if necessary. Meanwhile, Garrett was making his next move. Amara received another message, this time dripping with condescension. "I know this is hard for you," it read, "but you're not getting any younger. At least you'll still have your boutique to keep you busy." Amara saved the message, adding it to the growing file of evidence she was building. She forwarded it to Valerie with a brief note. "Use this." The lawyer's response came quickly. Perfect. But it wasn't just the messages. Garrett's actions were becoming increasingly desperate. Amara discovered he had used their joint credit card to book first-class tickets to an exclusive resort in the Caribbean for himself and his new girlfriend, a young, light-skinned woman Amara recognized from one of his office parties. The audacity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Amara wasted no time. She called the credit card company to report fraudulent charges, calmly explaining the situation. The representative assured her the charges would be reversed and the card would be canceled immediately. Garrett would arrive at the airport only to find his tickets invalidated. By the end of the week, Garrett's new life was already unraveling. Amara's lawyer filed for an emergency hearing to address his financial misconduct, citing his unauthorized use of shared assets and his attempts to claim property that wasn't legally his. Valerie was confident they had a strong case, and Amara trusted her implicitly. Still, there was a part of her that couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Garrett's betrayal wasn't just a legal battle. It was a deeply personal wound. He had taken her love and turned it into a weapon, attempting to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. But Amara refused to let him win. In the quiet moments when the house felt too empty and the magnitude of the situation threatened to overwhelm her, she reminded herself of one simple truth. She had prepared for this. Every decision she had made, the separate accounts, the legal protections, the careful documentation, had been for this exact scenario. Garrett had underestimated her, and that would be his downfall. As the hearing date approached, Amara focused on her work. The boutique was thriving, and she refused to let Garrett's actions derail her progress. Friday came, bringing with it the usual hustle and bustle of her busiest day. Amara unpacked a new shipment of designer handbags, her hands steady and her mind sharp. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a call from Garrett's mother. Amara hesitated before answering, bracing herself for the inevitable confrontation. The older woman's voice was strained, a mix of anger and desperation. "Amara, I've just spoken to Garrett. He says you've frozen his accounts and canceled his trip." What's going on?" Amara smiled faintly, arranging the handbags in a neat display. "Did he mention that he drained our joint account to pay for that trip? Or that he's claiming ownership of my house and business?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Garrett's mother sighed. "He said you were being vindictive." "Vindictive?" Amara repeated, her tone sharp. "I'm protecting what's mine." The call ended soon after, leaving Amara with a sense of satisfaction. Garrett's mother might not fully understand the situation, but she no longer sounded convinced of her son's innocence. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. That evening, as Amara locked up the boutique, she felt a surge of resolve. Garrett had played his hand, and now it was her turn. She wasn't just fighting to protect her assets, she was fighting for her dignity, her independence, and the life she had built on her own terms. Garrett might have thought he could break her, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Garrett's confidence faltered the moment he realized his grand plan wasn't going as smoothly as he'd imagined. The first sign was the canceled tickets. He and his new girlfriend, a young blonde named Emily, had arrived at the airport expecting to board a first-class flight to the Caribbean. Instead, they were met with a curt response from the airline desk agent. The tickets were invalid, the payment method flagged as fraudulent. Garrett's irritation turned to fury when Emily asked with a note of skepticism, "Didn't you say this was all sorted?" He mumbled something about a misunderstanding, but she didn't look convinced. The next blow came when they reached the hotel. Garrett had assured Emily they'd be staying in a luxury suite at one of the island's finest resorts. But when they arrived, the reservation had been canceled and there was no room available. Frustrated and embarrassed, Garrett tried to blame the hotel staff, but Emily wasn't buying it. "This was supposed to be a vacation," she muttered, crossing her arms. "Not a disaster." By the time they returned to the city, Garrett's carefully constructed facade was starting to crumble. He attempted to access their joint account, only to find it frozen. His personal credit cards were already maxed out, a secret he'd been keeping from everyone, including Emily. For the first time, he began to grasp the depth of Amara's preparedness. She wasn't the naive woman he'd assumed she was. She had been one step ahead of him all along. Back at home, Amara received the news with calm satisfaction. Valerie, her lawyer, called with updates as the pieces fell into place. "The emergency motion to freeze the accounts was approved," Valerie said, "and we've secured an expedited hearing to address his misconduct. With the evidence you've provided, we're in a strong position." Amara listened, taking in the details. She had spent months preparing for this, and now it was paying off. Garrett's attempts to destabilize her had only served to reinforce her resolve. Meanwhile, Garrett's desperation grew. He began sending a series of increasingly frantic messages, swinging between anger, manipulation, and attempts at reconciliation. "You've ruined everything," one message read. "All I wanted was a clean break, and you turned it into a war." Another followed shortly after. "You can't handle this on your own, Amara. You're going to regret being so vindictive." Amara saved each message, forwarding them to Valerie with a note, "More fuel for the fire." But the turning point wasn't just about Garrett's financial missteps or his unraveling plans. It was about the way Amara reclaimed her power, piece by piece. She refused to engage with his attempts to provoke her, maintaining a dignified silence while she focused on her work and her future. The boutique continued to thrive, its success unaffected by the turmoil in her personal life. Customers came in droves, some of them drawn by the whispers of gossip that circulated in the community. "You're an inspiration," one woman said after purchasing a designer handbag. "I heard about what you're going through, and I just want to say, keep fighting. Men like that don't deserve women like you." Amara smiled, touched by the support. She hadn't expected her private struggle to resonate so widely, but it was clear that her resilience was striking a chord. As the emergency hearing approached, Garrett's frustration reached a boiling point. He attempted to file a counterclaim, arguing that he was entitled to half of Amara's business and assets. His reasoning was laughable. He claimed he had provided moral support throughout their marriage, which he believed entitled him to a share of her success. Valerie was unimpressed. "Moral support," she said during one of their strategy sessions. "We'll tear that apart in court. Between the separate property documentation and the evidence of his financial misconduct, he doesn't have a leg to stand on." Amara nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for Valerie's unwavering confidence. She had chosen her legal team carefully, and it was clear they were as invested in her victory as she was. The night before the hearing, Amara sat in her home office reviewing the files she had compiled. Every receipt, text message, and legal document was meticulously organized, a testament to her foresight and determination. She thought back to the early days of her marriage, when she had believed Garrett was her partner in every sense of the word. The man who had once seemed so supportive and loving had revealed himself to be something else entirely, a manipulative opportunist who underestimated her strength. But Garrett's mistake wasn't just underestimating her, it was failing to understand that Amara had built her life on a foundation of resilience. Every challenge she had faced as a black woman in business, every obstacle she had overcome, had prepared her for this moment. Garrett might have thought he could take everything from her, but he had only succeeded in showing her how much she was capable of. The next morning, Amara walked into the courtroom with her head held high. Garrett was already there, dressed in a sharp suit that couldn't disguise the tension in his posture. His new girlfriend, Emily, was conspicuously absent. Rumor had it she had left him after their failed vacation, unwilling to stick around for his mountain problems. Valerie greeted Amara with a reassuring smile. "Are you ready?" she asked. Amara nodded. More than ready. The hearing was everything Amara had hoped it would be. Valerie presented the evidence with precision, laying out Garrett's financial misconduct, his attempts to claim assets that weren't his, and his ongoing pattern of manipulation. Garrett's lawyer tried to argue that he had contributed to Amara's success, but the judge was unimpressed. "The evidence is clear," the judge said, addressing Garrett directly. "You have no legal claim to your wife's business or personal property. Your actions demonstrate a blatant disregard for marital and financial responsibility." By the end of the hearing, Garrett's arrogance had all but evaporated. The judge ruled in Amara's favor, freezing all remaining shared assets and ordering Garrett to repay the funds he had taken from their joint account. He was also required to cover Amara's legal fees, a final blow that left him visibly shaken. Outside the courthouse, Amara took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Garrett's downfall wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about reclaiming her autonomy and proving to herself that she was stronger than he ever gave her credit for. As she walked away, her heels clicking confidently against the pavement, Amara felt a newfound sense of freedom. Garrett might have tried to tear her down, but she had risen above him. And now she was ready to focus on the future, on her business, her growth, and the life she had always deserved. The courtroom had barely emptied before Garrett's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. As Amara walked out with Valerie by her side, Garrett lingered behind, slumped in his chair, his lawyer speaking in hushed tones. The weight of the judge's decision had landed squarely on his shoulders, and it was clear he had no plan for what came next. By the time he returned to his temporary apartment, a dingy studio he had rented after Emily had unceremoniously dumped him, Garrett's phone was already buzzing with messages. Friends he hadn't heard from in months suddenly seemed eager to distance themselves. Word of the court's decision spread quickly, and Garrett's reputation as a charming, successful professional was beginning to unravel. What hurt most wasn't just the financial loss or the public humiliation. It was the realization that he had underestimated Amara completely. He had assumed she would crumble under the weight of his betrayal, that she would retreat into helplessness and let him take what he wanted. Instead, she had been prepared for every move he made, dismantling his plans with the precision of someone who had seen it coming long before he acted. For Amara, the days following the hearing brought a mix of relief and renewed focus. Valerie handled the legal cleanup, ensuring every aspect of the settlement was enforced. Garrett's attempts to stall or appeal were swiftly dismissed, and Amara's assets remained firmly under her control. The boutique continued to thrive, and its success undiminished by the personal turmoil she had faced. One afternoon, while organizing a new display at her flagship store, Amara received a call from Jasmine. Her friend's voice carried the familiar mix of exasperation and humor. "Girl, you won't believe this," Jasmine said. "Garrett's trying to spin the whole thing like he's the victim. He's telling people you blindsided him in court." Amara chuckled, shaking her head. "Let him talk. He's only digging himself a deeper hole." And dig he did. Garrett's attempts to salvage his reputation became increasingly desperate. He complained to anyone who would listen about how cruel Amara had been, conveniently omitting the part where he had emptied their joint account and tried to claim her business as his own. His former co-workers began to distance themselves after hearing the full story, and even his own family started questioning his narrative. His mother, Barbara, called Amara not long after the hearing. Her tone was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Amara," she began, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. Garrett told us things about you, about the marriage, that we now know weren't true." Amara listened silently, letting Barbara's words wash over her. The apology was unexpected but not unwelcome. Still, it didn't erase the pain of their initial betrayal, their willingness to believe Garrett's lies without question. "Thank you for saying that," Amara replied finally. "But what Garrett did wasn't just about me. It was about his inability to take responsibility for his own failures." Barbara sighed. "We see that now. He's been staying with us since the hearing. It's not easy." Amara didn't respond. Garrett's situation wasn't her concern anymore. She had spent enough time and energy dealing with his chaos. Now she was focused on rebuilding and moving forward. For Garrett, however, moving forward proved impossible. His financial woes worsened as creditors began calling. The luxury lifestyle he had tried to maintain was no longer sustainable, and his attempts to secure a new job were hampered by the rumors surrounding his behavior. Employers were wary of hiring someone with a history of financial misconduct, especially one so public. Adding to his humiliation was Emily, who had taken to social media to air her grievances about their short-lived relationship. Her posts, filled with vague but pointed remarks about toxic older men and relationships built on lies, quickly gained traction, further tarnishing Garrett's reputation. Amara, meanwhile, was flourishing. The boutique's expansion plans were ahead of schedule, and she had secured a partnership with a prominent luxury designer. an opportunity that promised to elevate her brand to new heights. She threw herself into her work, channeling the lessons she had learned from her marriage into her business. She also began mentoring young Black entrepreneurs, offering advice on everything from financial planning to navigating systemic bias in the industry. Her story, once a painful chapter in her life, became a source of inspiration for others. One evening, while reviewing designs for her next boutique location, Amara received an unexpected visitor. It was Amanda, Garrett's sister, clutching a small gift bag and looking sheepish. "I hope I'm not intruding," Amanda said. I wanted to apologize for everything." Amara raised an eyebrow but gestured for Amanda to sit. Over the next hour, Amanda explained how Garrett had spun his version of events, convincing their family that Amara was cold and controlling. It wasn't until the court hearing, when the evidence was laid bare, that they realized the truth. "We believed him because we wanted to," Amanda admitted. "It was easier than seeing him for who he really is. But you saw through him all along." Amara nodded, her expression calm. "It wasn't easy, but I've learned that sometimes people show you who they are. You just have to be willing to believe them." As Amanda left, Amara felt a weight lift. The acknowledgement from Garrett's family didn't erase the past, but it offered a sense of closure. They had been complicit in his lies, but now they were beginning to see the truth. The next few weeks brought more signs of Garrett's decline. Mutual acquaintances reported that he had moved back into his childhood bedroom, his grand plans for a new life with Emily reduced to ashes. His attempts to date again were met with skepticism, as word of his behavior had spread far and wide. Even those who didn't know the full story were wary of his reputation. For Amara, it was a vindication, not because she wanted him to suffer, but because it proved that her strength and resilience had carried her through. Garrett's collapse wasn't her victory. Her victory was in the life she was building without him. On a sunny afternoon, as Amara stood in her newest boutique location, surrounded by the fruits of her labor, she felt a deep sense of pride. Garrett had tried to take everything from her, but in the end, he had only succeeded in showing her how strong she truly was. Her success was her own, and no one could ever take that away. Garrett sat in his childhood bedroom, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls covered with remnants of his teenage years. Posters of bands he hadn't listened to in decades and faded photographs from high school were a stark contrast to the life he'd once projected. The man who had prided himself on his charisma and sophistication now found himself surrounded by evidence of his stagnation. His mother, Barbara, knocked gently on the door before stepping inside, holding a tray with a plate of dinner. She set it down on the desk, her face etched with a quiet disapproval. "Garrett, you need to figure something out," she said, her voice weary. "You can't stay here forever." "I'm working on it," Garrett mumbled, though the words felt hollow even to him. He wasn't working on anything. Every attempt to regain his footing had ended in failure. He had tried applying for new jobs, but his reputation preceded him. The whispers of his financial misconduct and failed marriage had reached potential employers, leaving him with little hope of securing a position that matched his ambitions. He had even resorted to reaching out to old friends and colleagues, but their responses were lukewarm at best. Most were polite but distant, their sympathy thinly veiled as indifference. In desperation, Garrett turned to schemes he once considered beneath him. He joined a multi-level marketing company that promised quick money, convinced he could sell overpriced products to unsuspecting acquaintances. But even that venture fizzled out within weeks, as his social circle had all but vanished. Meanwhile, Amara thrived. Her success was impossible for him to ignore, not just because of their shared history, but because it was everywhere. Her boutiques were featured in local business magazines and national lifestyle blogs. Photos of her standing confidently in her flagship store or attending exclusive events filled his social media feeds, each one a reminder of what he had lost and what she had built without him. The bitterness festered. Garrett convinced himself that Amara's success was a direct result of his sacrifices, though, in truth, he had contributed nothing. He began to tell anyone who would listen that he had been instrumental in her rise, spinning a narrative where he was the victim of her ambition. "She never appreciated me," he told his sister Amanda during a rare family gathering. "I gave everything to that marriage, and she just left me behind." Amanda raised an eyebrow, her patience worn thin. "Garrett, you left her. You drained the joint account, tried to claim her business, and ran off with someone half your age. Don't rewrite history." His face flushed with anger, but he couldn't muster a response. Amanda's words stung because they were true. Despite his dwindling options, Garrett refused to take responsibility. Instead, he fixated on revenge, convinced that Amara had somehow wronged him. He began drafting letters to her, each one angrier than the last, but none of them sent. In his darkest moments, he considered filing another legal challenge to the divorce settlement, though his lawyer had warned him it would be futile. Still, the thought of dragging Amara back into the mess he had created gave him a twisted sense of satisfaction. But Amara wasn't interested in his games. Her focus was firmly on her future. With the success of her boutiques, she had begun mentoring other entrepreneurs, particularly young black women looking to navigate the challenges of business ownership. Her workshops were well attended, her advice sought after. She was building more than a business. She was building a legacy. One day, Amara received an unexpected email from a journalist working on a feature about influential women in business. The reporter wanted to profile her journey, focusing on how she had built her empire while overcoming personal and professional challenges. Amara agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to inspire others. When the article was published, it painted a vivid picture of Amara's resilience and determination. It didn't mention Garrett by name, but it alluded to the obstacles she had faced in her personal life. The story went viral, shared widely across social media, and brought a flood of new customers to her boutiques. Garrett saw the article too, of course. It was shared in group chats he was still part of, posted by people he once called friends. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive of Amara, with many praising her strength and grace. For Garrett, it was another humiliating reminder of how far he had fallen. In a final act of desperation, he sent her a message. It was short, bitter, and reeked of defeat. "You think you've won, but you'll see. I was the best thing that ever happened to you." Amara didn't respond. She forwarded the message to Valerie, who added it to the growing file of Garrett's attempts to intimidate and manipulate her. It was another small victory in a long list of wins that had cemented Amara's position as not just a survivor, but a leader. As the weeks turned into months, Garrett's life continued to unravel. He was evicted from his studio apartment after falling behind on rent and was forced to move back in with his parents. His mother's patience wore thin, her once gentle reprimands turning into sharp criticisms. "Garrett, you're a grown man," Barbara said one evening after another argument. "It's time to take responsibility for your choices." But responsibility was the one thing Garrett refused to face. He spent his days brooding, his nights filled with regret and self-pity. The world had moved on without him, and he had no one to blame but himself. Amara, on the other hand, continued to rise. Her newest boutique location was an instant success, and she was already scouting locations for a fourth. She had moved past Garrett, her focus squarely on her own growth and the community she was building. In the end, Garrett's collapse wasn't just a consequence of his actions, it was a reflection of who he had always been. Amara had seen through the facade, prepared for his betrayal, and emerged stronger for it. Garrett, blinded by his own arrogance, had underestimated her, and now he was left with nothing but the consequences of his own choices. A year after the divorce, Amara stood at the entrance of her third boutique, her hand steady on the oversized scissors poised to cut the ceremonial ribbon. Cameras flashed, capturing her radiant smile, her poise, and the unmistakable energy of someone who had triumphed against the odds. The crowd, a mix of loyal customers, local influencers, and fellow business owners, erupted into applause as the ribbon fell. This wasn't just another milestone for Amara's growing empire. It was a testament to everything she had endured and overcome. Inside, the store buzzed with excitement. Rows of carefully curated designer pieces lined the walls, and the air hummed with the sound of conversation and the clicking of heels on polished floors. Amara mingled effortlessly, her genuine warmth drawing people to her. This was her world now, thriving, independent, and untouched by the storm Garrett had tried to unleash. But success, Amara realized, was more than just business. It was about the life she had rebuilt, the strength she had found within herself, and the legacy she was creating for others. As the event wound down, Amara found a quiet moment in her office. She looked at the framed image hanging on the wall, a screenshot of the last text Garrett had sent her before she blocked him. "You'll regret this. Your little shop won't mean anything when you're old and alone." Beneath it, another framed item hung, a recent feature from a prominent business magazine that named her one of the most influential entrepreneurs of the year. She couldn't help but smile at the juxtaposition. His words, meant to diminish her, now served as a reminder of how far she had come. Her phone buzzed with a notification from Valerie. "Garrett's latest appeal has been dismissed," the message read. "He's also been ordered to cover additional court costs." Amara let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Garrett's desperate attempts to challenge the divorce settlement had become almost predictable. Each one ended the same way, with a swift dismissal and a reminder of how thoroughly he had been defeated. Garrett, meanwhile, remained trapped in the life he had created for himself. His attempts to rebuild had been futile. He was living with his parents, working a low-paying job and burdened by debt. His charm, once his greatest weapon, had dulled in the face of his tarnished reputation. Mutual acquaintances occasionally shared updates about him, though Amara rarely asked. Apparently, Garrett spent much of his time lamenting how unfair life had been to him. His bitterness, once directed at Amara, had turned inward, eroding what little was left of his pride. One day, as Amara was reviewing expansion plans for her fourth boutique, an unexpected visitor walked through the doors of her flagship store. It was Emily, Garrett's former girlfriend. She looked different, more grounded, perhaps, or simply less naive. "I hope I'm not bothering you," Emily said, clutching a modest handbag. I wanted to apologize." Amara tilted her head, intrigued. "Apologize? For what?" "For believing him," Emily said, her voice faltering. "He told me so many things about you, how you were controlling, how you didn't support him, And I believed it because I didn't know better. But after everything, I see now that he was the problem, not you. Amara studied her for a moment, then nodded. We all learn at our own pace, she said, her tone kind but firm. The important thing is what you do with that knowledge. Emily hesitated before speaking again. I've started my own business, a small consulting firm. Nothing big yet, but I want to build something real. Watching what you've done, it's inspired me. Amara smiled. Good. Just remember, protect yourself always. Build something that no one can take from you. After Emily left, Amara returned to her work, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't just survived Garrett's betrayal. She had thrived in spite of it. And in doing so, she had become a beacon for others navigating their own struggles. Over the next few months, Amara's life continued to flourish. Her fourth boutique opened to even greater fanfare than the third, and she began exploring opportunities to launch a line of luxury accessories. She also expanded her mentorship programs, creating scholarships and workshops for young Black entrepreneurs. But it wasn't just her professional life that had transformed. Personally, Amara had found a renewed sense of peace. She traveled more, reconnecting with herself and the world around her. She spent time with friends who had stood by her through everything, their bonds stronger than ever. One evening, as she sat on the patio of her home, the house Garrett had once tried to claim, she reflected on how far she had come. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had shaped her into someone stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than ever before. Garrett's name rarely crossed her mind now. He was a shadow of the past, a reminder of what she had overcome, but no longer a presence in her life. The power he had once held over her had vanished, replaced by a confidence that could never be shaken. The story of Amara's rise wasn't just about success. It was about resilience, self-respect, and the ability to rebuild after betrayal. And as she looked out at the horizon, the city lights twinkling in the distance, she knew that her best chapters were still ahead. Don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories and content. Share this video with your friends, and check out other videos on the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next.